Welcome back. Today we're going to be talking about public opinion and how in democratic societies, how people voting and people expressing their opinions are really the legitimacy of getting leadership. And we're going to do that today by examining two essays. The one that's in your book by Walter Lippman, that one talks about the pseudo environment. And then we're going to talk a little bit about a very important essay that is not in your book by John Boyd called Destruction and Creation. So we have the objectives today is we're going to define and understand the pseudo environment, and we're going to understand the criteria we use, all of us use when we talk in terms of making a decision and deciding what facts we accept, what opinions we accept, and ones that we don't. So far in the class, we've talked about this idea of the rules of the game, the Constitution, and who has the duty, or who do we look to interpret the Constitution? The Supreme Court. And then last section, we talked about the difference between civil liberties and civil rights. So we were talking in terms of the individual and the state and how our system is unique, and also who do we look to, who has the legitimate duty, the legitimate demands of telling us what the Constitution and what the law means. This can change over time, as Thurgood Marshall talked about. This can change even from 1 week, as we had last week with the Supreme Court determining about gay and trans rights in the workplace, or it can last for decades, right? It depends on who's actually on the court. So again, we're moving now to this idea of how does an individual make these decisions? What makes an individual vote one way or the other? What makes an individual choose a path of action? And so that's what we're talking about today. So in this section of the class, in much more depth, we're going to be talking about what goes on, and not from a psychologically point of view from a scientist, but from the vernacular, the everyday ideas that people have when it pertains to politics and government and the mass media. So again, this is where we are, and we start off with Walter Lippman's article. So again, so that you understand the logic of where we're going and the structure of the course. So now we're concentrating on the individual. Now we're concentrating on how our leaders are chosen. And so we start with the rules, right? We start with the Constitution. The Constitution gives us these processes, like the Electoral College. And now we're moving to the individual level on how a person behaves, how a person chooses to do something. Now, you might be saying, well, you know, some people don't have freedom. You might be saying that the system creates behaviors. Well, this is sort of true and sort of not true. And so this is why we talk about the individual and the individual's actions in terms vis-a-vis of the law and of the state. So if we go to page 130, Walter Lippman's essay, essay number 27, and again, reading the introduction of the authors tell us why they put this in this collection in the textbook. And they basically say that, again, as I said, that a person's opinion or a person's vote is the starting point for all forms of democracy. And this is what gives us this idea of legitimacy. However, the authors also note on page 130 that Lippman feared that the American public superficial and easily manipulated opinions about important questions of public policy would ultimately undermine the democratic system. For Lippman, the proper role of American political leaders is not to follow blindly the whims of the public, but rather to educate and lead the public. And in the times we live in today, you can see how this is a very interesting and a very important point. We have elected officials who are, most of them are professional politicians. We have people in the media, reporters, who most of them are educated through a political system. They're political reporters. Very few of them have any scientific background. And then we have a question of what is scientifically feasible? What do we use as evidence and facts in dealing with the pandemic that we're in right now? One of the reasons why I'm videotaping to you right now is because the schools are closed. Who decided that? The second event that you can see what happens is, the issues between why nations fight in wars. Why do nations and states hate each other? Why do some have an alliance? What is the decision-making process of the individual who leads the state or the elite who run the state? We'll get into that later, but Lippman right now shows us this idea of the pseudo-environment. And he's concerned because of the manipulation people have in their emotional makeup. All of us have this kind of type of manipulation. So he starts off talking about this island. There's an island in the ocean where in 1914, a few Englishmen, Frenchmen, and Germans lived. No cables reach their island, and the British mail steamer comes once in every 60 days. In September, it had not yet come, and these islanders were still talking about the latest newspaper, which told about the approaching trial of Madame Collot for the shooting of Gaston Clement. It was therefore with more than the usual eagerness that the whole colony assembled at the quay on the day in mid-September to hear from the captain what the verdict had been. But in 1914, in the summer of 1914, there was much more interesting or exciting news, and that was World War I. They had learned that for over 6 weeks now, those of them who were English and those of them who were French had been fighting in behalf of the sanctity of treaties against those of them who were German. For 6 strange weeks, they had acted as if they were friends when in fact they were enemies. And again, think about this, right? How do we determine our actions? How do we determine what is the truth? How do we determine questions of fact and opinion? Now, if you remember correctly, we talked about in science, right? A fact is something that is measurable usually by a third party, right? A third or independent party. It can be replicated, right? A procedure can be replicated. That is a fact. An opinion, right? An opinion is an emotion. An opinion you can think about is an emotion that one feels. So if I have an opinion, and let's say I hate broccoli, and let's say that you are a broccoli lover, and you tell me all of the things that make broccoli great. You tell me that it's fiber, you tell me it's full of vitamins, you tell me it's full of, helps my blood, helps my cholesterol. If I eat broccoli, I'll be a happy and healthy and successful person. Those are right. Those are facts. I can measure the vitamins in broccoli. I can measure the fiber in broccoli, and you're giving me facts. However, I have the opinion. Maybe when I was a baby, someone fed me broccoli and I didn't like it, or maybe I hated my mother and she fed me broccoli and forced it down my throat, or maybe I saw broccoli one time being grown and a cow pooed on it. Okay, so There might be a bunch of opinions or there might be a bunch of emotions for me not liking broccoli. You can talk until you're blue in the face. You can keep on giving me facts and facts and facts and facts, and I will not like broccoli. Because broccoli is an opinion, right? My liking broccoli is an opinion. It's not necessarily based on facts. Now, yes, broccoli example is fairly mundane. But what I'm trying to show you is that what we perceive as reality is not. So when Lippman starts in his essay, he says that we have this island, and this island is a microcosm of Europe in 1914, and we have basically English, French, and Germans living together as if they were in peace. Because the perception of everybody in this colony was that their countries were at peace. Where in actuality, right, the fact was that these three countries were at war. And all those things that it means. Lippman goes on. For 6 strange weeks, they had acted as if they were friends when in fact they were enemies. But their plight was not so different from that of the most of the population of Europe. They had been mistaken for 6 weeks on the continent. The interval may have been only 6 days or 6 hours. There was an interval. There was a moment when the picture of Europe on which men were conducting their business as usual did not in any way correspond to the Europe which was about to make a jumble of their lives. So we can see this, right? We can see this in our era. We can see this in our day. So as I may have told the class, I was working in Washington, D.C. last year. And I was studying the pandemic in China early on. And my boss at the time did not take the social distancing routine seriously. She said that her husband was going to stay going to his local bar, and that her kid was going to stay going to concerts, and that she was exposed to the Undersecretary of State at the time, who was dealing with some Brazilians, and the Brazilians had there was a fear that the Brazilians had infected the Undersecretary. And so I wrote an email saying that I thought this was a very inopportune and wrong-headed, I used more tactful language, but that they weren't taking the social distancing very, very seriously, and that I thought that the whole staff of the whole office was threatened to get sick. 2 or 3 weeks later, of course, we had the shutdown, and 2 or 3 weeks later, we have this debate. Now it's turned into a sort of a political debate of wearing masks and having different types of activities, legal and sanctioned, and not legal and not sanctioned. This again is what Lippman's talking about when we talk in terms of the pseudo environment. My pseudo environment, I took what the scientists had to say about COVID-19 very seriously. My boss did not. Which person was right and which person was wrong? Well, again, we're talking about opinions, not facts. To support my opinion, I can look at this point in time, nearly, I believe, 160,000 people have died from COVID-19. My boss, she can probably look at the protests that happened, or the opening of Trump's campaign in Tulsa, Oklahoma at this time. So again, we tend to go more into this emotional perspective. If a person is a friend of ours, we act differently to that person than if a person's an enemy of ours. We cast a person in these different categories. We do this because we have to. It's a way we deal with reality. There was a time for each man when he was still adjusted to an environment that no longer existed. Right? So there is, and this happens to politicians, And this is why, one of the reasons why I said earlier that a lot of our politicians, they're not looking for solutions. They want to perpetuate our problems, because if we would solve some of these problems, then of course we wouldn't need them. We would look for other politicians. So again, if you look at old magazines, and you look at the problems that they have, you see that these problems are very, very similar to the ones that we have today. Lippman goes on about talking about this difference between being in a climate or an environment of war and thinking that you're in one of peace. All over the world, as late as July 25th, men were making goods that they would not be able to ship, buying goods that they would not be able to import. Careers were being planned, enterprises contemplated, hopes and expectations entertained, all in the belief that the world as known was the world as it was. And again, if you look at our lives today, in a mere matter of weeks, has the world changed due to the pandemic? I believe it has. Did you change your plans? Did I change my plans? Are we acting as if the world is as it was instead of as it is? Again, this is one of those really, really critical questions. What do we do? And the sign of an educated person is his ability to develop critical thinking. The sign of an educated person is not a grade on the wall. The sign of an educated person is not a diploma on the wall. The sign of an educated person is to be able to peer across the time horizon, to anticipate issues, to anticipate problems. Now, I'm not saying people could have anticipated a pandemic, but Bill Gates does talk about the fact that he has talked a great deal about a pandemic for a long time. I'm not saying that people who are suddenly unemployed could have anticipated that. And I'm not blaming anybody who finds themselves in that situation. My point is that this is why you don't have financially, this is why you don't want to go into debt, a great deal of debt. This is why you want to have savings. This is why you want, what I'm assuming that you're in school, is to develop skills so that you are able to, again, assess where you are periodically and look at the ground rules and look at your assumptions of how you live your life. Because if I was a person, right, I was an English person or a French person, and a lot of my business was with Germans, all of a sudden it's gone. And we see this with the farmers in the United States when it comes to trade with China. I'm exporting soybeans to China, and all of a sudden I'm not. Careers were being planned, enterprises contemplated, hopes and expectations entertained, and all in the belief that the world was as known as it was, as I said. Men were writing books describing that world. They trusted the picture in their mind, and then over 4 years later, on a Thursday morning, came the news of an armistice, and people gave vent to their unfettered relief that the slaughter was over. Yet, in the 5 days before the real armistice came, though the end of the war had been celebrated, several thousand young men died on the battlefield, right? So an armistice was proclaimed. The armistice was going to proclaim the end of the war 5 days hence. And so people thought they were in just the opposite of the islanders, right? People thought they were in a state of peace when in actuality, they still were in a state of war. He goes on, looking back, we see, right, how indirectly we know the environment in which, nevertheless, we live. We, looking back, we look at the environment and we realize we really did not know what was in the environment. And again, I would contend the same is true today. The same is true today. On many of the really difficult questions we deal with, are we dealing with facts Are we dealing with feelings? Are we dealing with both? Do we understand this environment? Do we really understand? Or are we picking and choosing? Of course, we're picking and choosing. Everybody picks and chooses, right? And so there's a filter or a lens that we use. And in this filter or lens, we perceive reality. We perceive reality. Now, again, on a personal note, I'm wearing a tie, I'm wearing a jacket. Some people commented on the earlier videotapes that I had a fan going and a light going because it's hot. It's summertime. Why do I wear a jacket and a tie? Because I'm trying to project, right? I'm trying to tell you that this is a serious endeavor. Is it? I believe it is. Do you believe it is? Maybe not. Maybe, right? So we're using a lens, we're using a filter, and we think this is reality, but in fact, it may or may not be. Who knows? I might be a person with no academic credentials at all, putting a tie and a suit coat on, making a video, and putting it out there. You don't know. Of course you do, because you're being certified students in a class through a college. But what if you didn't have that, right? Or what if I'm perpetuating fraud? Or what if I just make stuff up? Some professors do that, right? Some professors do that. Some professors are giving all the class, the whole class is their opinion. This is what happened when I was an undergraduate. I went to the University of Wisconsin, Madison, and I had a lot of professors, most of them, who were Marxists. And this was during the Cold War. And they taught Marxism. And so, again, that was their filter. That was their lens. That was their consciousness. So, again, this is where we are. Right? We pick and choose what we're going to believe. And this is what Lippman talked about when he talks about the pseudo environment. The pseudo environment is something that we all have inside our heads, and it's more like a map. And sometimes the pseudo environment, or sometimes our actions and how we interpret phenomena in the real environment, affects the pseudo environment. And he gives some examples, right? We can see too, I'm on page 131, we can see too that while they governed and fought, traded and reformed in the world as they imagined it to be, they produced results, or failed to produce any, in a world as it was. So what happens is we have a distinction between our actions and our beliefs inside our heads and our behaviors, which are manipulated in the real environment. They started for the Indies. He's talking about Columbus and the explorers. They started for the Indies and found America. They diagnosed evil and hanged old women, witch trials. They thought they could grow rich by always selling and never buying, financial bubbles. A caliph, obeying what he conceived would be the will of Allah, burned the Library of Alexandria. The only feeling that anyone can have about an event he does not experience is the feeling aroused by his or her mental image of that event, right? So you see, again, right now we're having a debate, and if you recall a previous film, I said that the Confederate battle flag was close to being, and I understand it to be, a swastika. What did I mean by that? I said that the Confederacy as an entity, the facts of its constitution, and the facts that people fought to defend slavery. Just as the Nazis said that some people were unhuman, right, Untermenschen, so did the Confederacy, as Frederick Douglass's essay and speech talks about. So yes, that is a political and historic fact, but it's also my interpretation of that fact. And that's what the debate's over. Now again, if we want to talk about mob rule, there are processes, right? The process that put a statue of Robert E. Lee in front of the courthouse of your local town, right? There's also a process to take it down. I'm not defending the tearing down of statues, but what I'm trying to show you, trying to talk to you about is why people are acting, right? They have a mental picture, right? They have the mental picture. And many people, people who maybe live in the South, or maybe people who glorify the Confederacy, have a mental picture of Robert E. Lee, right? They have a mental picture of Robert E. Lee. Now, again, there are books. There are books about, was Lee a great general or not? Especially versus Grant. But I read in the paper today that Grant statue was also desecrated. Well, that tells me that people have a mental image of Grant that's wrong. I mean, that's wrong, historically wrong. As I've expressed before, that Grant actually broke the back of the Ku Klux Klan when he was president. And Grant made it one of his priorities to treat the freedmen and also the Native Americans much more humanely than they had been treated. But again, if you're just destroying stuff, you have a mental picture that there is somehow the symbols and the statues, all of them should come down. It's a mob rule. Now, some of you might say, well, that's a good mob rule. You're entitled to your opinions. But again, we're talking about this mental picture of and what's inside your pseudo environment, right? How do you interpret this reality? You and I can disagree. You might call me names. I might call you names, right? But we're all doing it because we have not, unless you're 100 and 200 years old, right? We have not physically experienced the Civil War. We're dealing with the feelings that are aroused by a mental picture. That is why, until we know what others think they know, we cannot truly understand their acts, right? Their motives. We must look at their motives. It is the insertion between man and his environment of the pseudo-environment. To that pseudo-environment, his behavior is a response. Okay, so we have three actors. We have three actors. We have the individual, we have the pseudo-environment, and we have the actual environment. Let me repeat that. We have the individual. Looks like all my markers are going. We have his perception, his or her perception of reality, called the pseudo-environment. And then we have the actual environment. Now, what's interesting about this is behavior manifests itself in the real environment, right? So if let's say you perceive me as an enemy, and I perceive you as a friend, and then I give you a present because I think you're my friend. I give you a present. What's going to be your reaction? Your reaction is going to be something of shock, or you're going to think it's a bomb, or you're going to think that, you know, I'm a sleazebag or phony, whatever you want to think, right? Because it doesn't match your mental picture. However, what happens is you got a gift from me. My behavior, right? My behavior and your behavior is carried out in the real environment. So what happens is you take my gift, you put it underwater, or you do whatever you think you have to be done, And then you interpret that gift. But the fact is that I gave you a gift. And this is what happens with diplomats. This happens in international relations. This happens when leaders try to stop a war and try to determine a better relationship with a different country. This is what happens when groups, right, have a perception of being betrayed by political leaders or by any type of leaders. It is the insertion between man and his environment of the pseudo-environment. To that pseudo-environment, his behavior is a response. But because it is a behavior, the consequences, if they are acts, operate not in the pseudo-environment, where the behavior is stimulated, but in the real environment where the action eventuates. If the behavior is not a practical act, but what we call roughly thought and emotion, it may be a long time before there is any noticeable break in the texture of the fictitious world. But when the stimulus of the pseudo fact results in actions on things or other people, contradictions soon develop. Then comes the sensation of butting one's head against the wall, of learning by experience and witnessing, as Herbert Spencer's tragedy of the murder of a beautiful theory by a gang of brutal facts. And this is the problem we have today, is no one is differentiating between opinion and fact, and no one is arguing or differentiating between the pseudo-environment and the behaviors that are manifested in the real environment. So, again, an example of this is this dichotomy between protesting and voting. I hope you saw that in the Eyes on the Prize, the civil rights video that I assigned, that you saw how important it was to both Malcolm X and Dr. King. They joined forces to get voting registration. This is really at the heart of the civil rights agenda, because if you can have voting registration, then you can determine what type of leaders are going to be in your city council, in your governor's house, in the Congress, the presidents, and the governorships, right? You can determine who's going to be sheriff. You can determine all sorts of local and regional issues by who you vote for. Now, again, in this time, we see protests, and fine, great. Except what? Except will those protests be turned into votes? Because no matter how you like it, we go back to the Constitution. We go back next fall when we have an election. We go back there every 4 years. We have an election for president. Every 2 years, we have election for the Congress, the House of Representatives. And so are people voting? Half of us vote, right? 48% of us tend to vote in the election. 48%. Now, somehow people got into their pseudo environment that voting is not important, that voting does not change anything. Well, if you look at, again, the House of Representatives have a re-election rate roughly about 93, 94%. You have people like Nancy Pelosi who've been re-elected since 1974. Look at Joe Biden. Joe Biden has been in politics since he's been 29 years old. So yes, right? Yes. Does it matter if you vote or not? Will that change everything? Maybe, maybe not. Who knows? We don't know. But what do we know? What do we know? We know that if you do vote, right? If you do vote, and if people have easy voting registration, that is the issue, or that is the point where the founding fathers and the Constitution assume legitimacy, right? Popular sovereignty. They assume it. Why? Because you voted. What if you don't vote? That's your choice, right? you don't vote because of the reasons why you tell yourself it's not important. That's, again, a fairly, and we'll get into a moment, but that again is a fairly simple decision. You make decisions. It's your life. And so Lippman goes on and he talks about this idea of thought and emotion. He talks about, for certainly at the level of social life, what is called the adjustment of man to his environment takes place through the medium of fictions, right? And by fictions, I do not mean lies. I mean a representation of the environment which is in lesser or greater degree made by the man himself. The range of fiction extends all the way from the complete hallucination of the scientist to the scientist's perfectly self-conscious use of a schematic model, or his decision that for a particular problem, accuracy beyond a certain decimal point is not important. A work of fiction may have almost any degree of fidelity, and so long as the degree of fidelity can be taken into account, fiction is not misleading. In fact, human culture is very largely the selection, the rearrangement, the tracing of patterns upon, and the stylizing of what William James called, quote, the random irradiations of resettlements of our ideas, end quote. So again, was Robert E. Lee a great general? Was Robert E. Lee not a great general? Is the system racist? Is the system not racist? These are generalities. These are fictions. And what happens is we then rearrange our ideas, we rearrange our value systems into fulfilling or fitting neatly into these different fictions. Again, they're not lies. Fictions, right, are the building blocks of the pseudo environment. And this is what we're talking about. So, again, what are one of the fictions that we're dealing with? One of the fictions that we're dealing with is that you must go to college to make your life better. That is not true. That is a fiction, especially if you don't want to be in college. If you think of classes as a chore, if you don't want to read, you don't want to think, you don't want to write, then, right, it's not going to make your life any better. Matter of fact, we see a lot of people who were students who have heavy student loans who didn't develop much skills except for maybe some ideological importance in their pseudo environment. And now they find themselves with this debt, and they're actually worse off than a person who didn't go to college. Maybe, right? Maybe. And so this is, again, is it a fiction or not? My life, personally, I'm better off having gone to college. Matter of fact, I'm still in college, right? I'm here with you. I'm here talking, and we're talking about things that I started this journey in college, reading and writing about over 40 years ago. It still interests me. Okay, but not for all people, right? There's nothing wrong with following something that you're good at. There's nothing wrong with doing something that you want to do. Who cares what people think about it? But we all do. We all care greatly about what other people think. What is the perception of other people in our pseudo environment? So we give ourselves these fictions, right? These fictions. And I hear this all the time. Some students come to me and say, I'm an A student, but I'm not getting an A in your class, right? They're trying to say what? They're trying to say that it's my fault they're not getting an A in the class. Maybe it is, maybe it's not. Maybe you're very good at chemistry, but you're not very good at political science. Maybe you don't like my style. But let me just say, quite frankly, that we all have these different fictions. And we all have these things that stimulate our behaviors. But our behaviors then are a matter of the environment. So when a student comes to me and says, I don't understand why I'm not getting an A in your class, because I'm an A student, right? Well, maybe you are, maybe you're not. It's not, who am I to say? But I have a behavior, you didn't get any of the answers correct on the test, right? That is manifested in the real environment. That's a silly example, maybe, but again, we have these fictions, and sometimes it's actually important to believe these fictions, right? The famous story of Michael Jordan, when Michael Jordan in high school was not let on the team when he was a freshman, and that gave him motivation because he had a fiction that he was going to be a great basketball player. He wanted to play basketball. So what did that do? He practiced very hard on basketball. His mother said the basketball never left his hand that whole summer. He also grew, I think according to the documentary, he grew like a foot, 7 or 8 inches from the time he was a freshman in high school to the time he was a junior in high school. That helps too, right? So again, we're talking in terms of how we perceive ourselves, right? How do we perceive ourselves? What kind of fictions do we create when we create the pseudo environment? And that's, again, what Lippman's talking about. But the pseudo environment and these fictions are not lies. They are basically a way that we can deal with the ebb and flow of reality. The alternative to the use of fictions is a direct exposure to the ebb and flow of sensation. That is not a real alternative. For however refreshing it is to see at times with perfect innocent eye, innocence itself is not wisdom, though a source and corrective of wisdom. For the real environment is altogether too big, too complex, and too fleeting for direct acquaintance. Again, why do we build a map? Why do we draw a map? If you've looked at a map, they have a scale on the map, or a globe, it has a scale. If you would have a globe or a map that the scale was 1:1, it would be a realistic facilitation of what actually the distances are. It would be as big as a globe with a 1:1 scale would be as big as the globe, right? So the pseudo environment is a map of the real environment. It's our interpretation of the map of reality. It's not reality. Now, sometimes those things are correlated, but sometimes and many times they are not. For the real environment is altogether too big, too complex, and too fleeting. I repeat those because it's very important to understand. We are not equipped to deal with so much subtlety, so much variety, so many permutations and combinations. And although we have to act in that moment, we have to reconstruct it on a simpler model before we can manage with it. To traverse the world, men must have maps of the world. Their persistent difficulty is to secure the maps on which their own need or someone else's need has not sketched in the coast of Bohemia. I should like to think only about the worldwide spectacle of men acting upon their environment, moved by stimuli from their pseudo environments, right? So again, what is he saying? He's saying that people move, people act out of a belief of a mental picture of where they want to be. So every college dropout talks about, well, Gates dropped out, right? Or all these computer billionaires who dropped out. Vegetarians always talk in terms of Gandhi being a vegetarian. They never talk about Hitler being a vegetarian, which he was, right? That's an inconvenient fact. So does vegetarianism make you either a more loving person or make you a tyrant who is responsible for genocide? I would contend neither. But we have these certain mental pictures that people want to draw in the coast of Bohemia for us. I have nothing against vegetarianism. I'm just pointing out that when you talk to vegetarians, or when you talk in terms of, if you go to a vegetarian store, the people that the posters they have on the wall, They never have that certain fellow. Okay, so what are people doing? They're rationalizing. They're creating a pseudo environment in which their choice, they've already made their choice, and they're making an argument to themselves or to the people around them of why this choice is important. The same can be said for nations. It is to these special worlds, it is to these private groups or class or provincials or occupational or national or sectarian artifacts that the political adjustment of mankind in the great society takes place. Their variety and complication are impossible to describe. Yet these fictions determine a very great part of men's political behavior. We must think of perhaps 50 sovereign parliaments consisting of at least 100 legislative bodies, with them belong at least 50 hierarchies of provincial and municipal assemblies, and with their executive, administrative, and legislative organs, constitute the formal authority on earth. But that does not begin to reveal the complexity of political life. For in each of these innumerable centers of authority, there are parties, and these parties themselves hierarchies within their roots and classes, sections, cliques, and clans. And within these are the individual politicians, each with a personal center of a web of connections and memory and fear and hope. Somehow or other, for reasons often necessarily obscure, as a result of domination or compromise or log roll, there emerge from these political bodies commands which set armies in motion or make peace, conscript life, tax, exile, imprison, protect property, or confiscate it, encourage one kind of enterprise and discourage another, facilitate immigration or obstruct it, improve communication or censor it, establish schools, build navies, proclaim quote-unquote policies and quote-unquote destiny, raise economic barriers, make property or unmake it, bring one people under the rule of another, or favor one class as against another. For each of these decisions, some view of the facts is taken to be conclusive. Some view of the circumstances is accepted as the basis of inference and the stimulus of feeling. But what view of the facts and why that one, right? And this is a very, very important question, right? What view of the fact? And why this one? Right? Why this one? And we see how people react, how an idea, a fact, a situation will go, and people it'll ignite. Just like we talked about in Gitlow v. New York, how the results of a revolutionary slogan, the results of a pamphlet, you can't judge the effectiveness by the immediate result. Sometimes it takes time. Sometimes it takes a generation or two. It takes an experience, a shared emotional fiction, a shared emotional picture in the pseudo environment that makes people behave in the actual environment. And again, so this is where we are, right? We have defined the pseudo environment that everybody has. We're now going to answer this question or look at this question of why, right? Why do we act on certain issues? Why is it that people want to target a statue? Why is it that people want to destroy works of art? Why is it that people are offended, right? This is, again, offense is an opinion. And so we move on now to John Boyd's article on destruction and creation. And Boyd is a very interesting man, as Lippman once was. John Boyd is a retired colonel in the Air Force, and he wanted to try to determine this theory of how do we create things. And his work is very related to Thomas Kuhn's work on paradigms, on scientific revolutions. So Kuhn basically answers this idea of why do we get scientific revolutions? How do paradigms change? And Kuhn says that uh, from Aristotle uh, to modern physics, you start getting this breakdown of the theory. The theory starts not to answer very, very substantial or significant questions. People grow frustrated by this lack of theoretical explanation, and so they go seek out other theories. And you can see that we have people today who are in a revolutionary mode of thinking, or their pseudo environment thinks that they're in the revolutionary mode, and it comes to again basically saying everything that's been done is a failure, so we'll clean house. And so in Boyd's article called Destruction and Creation, he forms a theory on why we create things. Why is it that people create governments? Why is it that people create institutions? Why do they then why do those institutions or those creations die? And so, and it's a very, very important and interesting theory, and it's interesting to the point because it discounts much of Marxism. It discounts much of the economic motivations that is pervasive in academia and in our popular culture. And it talks in terms of, as Lippman, it talks in terms of the individual making decisions. Now, again, a lot of people don't tend to like this kind of talk because it gives a lot of freedom and a lot of responsibility to the individual. Right? You can't blame your parents, you can't blame society, you can't blame, it's you. You are making these decisions. And you decide what the mental pictures, you decide what the facts, you decide what are these things that, and how are you going to behave. So he goes, he starts, and this is not an assigned reading, and we're talking about this because the ultimate aspect of Boyd is that he gives us a criteria in which people actually make decisions. And he says his basic aim or goal, and our basic aim and goal as individuals, is to improve our capacity for independent action. So the criteria that we use to either cooperate or compete. So during this class, because of the pandemic, I am offering, started at 3 times a week, now twice a week, I am offering Zoom discussion exchanges. They're not mandatory, and these are used. I use these for a touchstone for the students to ask me either administrative or conceptual questions. And we have about 120 students enrolled in this class, and when in the future we'll have more, and roughly around 10, 15, 20, at most 15 students attend these exchanges, which is fine, right? So maybe they don't have questions, but they're making, the students are making a decision. Their decision is, right, going to this exchange, does this improve or undermine my independence of action? This is really the human element. This is really the criteria that we all use in order to make our situation better. He says the degree to which we cooperate or compete with others is driven by the need to satisfy this basic goal. If we believe that it is not possible to satisfy it alone without help from others, history shows us that this will agree to constrain upon our independent action in order to collectively pool skills and talents in the form of nations, corporations, labor unions, mafias, families, etc., so that obstacles standing in the way of the basic goal can either be removed or overcome. On the other hand, if the group cannot or does not attempt to overcome obstacles deemed important to many, or possibly any, of its individual members, the group must risk losing these and alienating its members. Under these circumstances, the alienated members may dissolve their relationship and remain independent in the form of the group, their own, or join another collective body in order to improve their capacity for independent action. This is the key, right? Independent action. This is the criteria that people use in making their decisions. So what happens when we have an adolescent in high school and they make a decision not to do their homework? They make this decision not to do their homework because they want not to do it. They don't say, and you hear this all the time, I'm not going to use this, right? I'm not going to use X class. I'm not going to use X thing. And so they view it, they discount it through their pseudo environment. They discount this. Okay. So we have the pseudo environment, we have the perception of facts and opinions. We have these, again, these fictions that we're dealing with, and we are making decisions. We are making decisions on the criteria of independence of actions. Why do we follow athletes? Why do we follow billionaires? We follow them because we believe that they have freedom. We believe that they are independent. They can do whatever you want. How many times have you heard people talk about, oh, if I had $1 million, right? Every time there's a big lottery, what happens? They go to the line and they interview, the local television station interviews the guy in the lottery line. And what's that person talking about? Oh, if I win the lottery, I'll give 30% to charity and 40% to the church, and then I'll give 20% to, the guy's up to 150%. He's giving it all away before he spends any. Yeah, well, I hope so. But usually what happens? Usually if we have money, we tend to not become better people. We tend to be more of what we are. We just have the freedom of action, right? We have this independence of action to do what we want. The old FU money. So again, we have this idea of the pseudo environment, and Boyd talks in terms of making decisions. To make timely decisions, to make these timely decisions implies that we must be able to form mental concepts of the observed reality as we perceive it and be able to change these concepts as reality itself appears to change. The concepts can then be used as a decision model for improving our capacity for independent action. Such a demand for decisions that literally impact our survival causes one to wonder, how do we generate or create the mental concepts to support this decision making, right? How do we create a concept? How do we determine what is in support of our independence, our search for independence actions? Do we cooperate or do we compete? Do we buy the Constitution or don't we? Do we buy our society or don't we? Do we buy our family or don't we? He goes on, there are two ways in which we can develop and manipulate mental concepts to represent observed reality. We can start from a comprehensive whole and break it down to its particulars, or we can start with the particulars and build towards a comprehensive whole. What he's basically talking about is the difference between analysis and synthesis, right? Analysis is deductive thinking and synthesis is inductive thinking. We're not going to go very much into that, but again, we need to understand that this is all a mental process. And we have this idea of independence of action. There are people who are talking now about, again, they don't believe our government serves their independence of actions, so they want to defect or they want to start something different. And so they discount the procedures, they discount the law, they discount these things, and they go and get a couple chains and get a couple tractors and pull down statues. Or they pull down other things. Why? Because in their pseudo environment, these are things that are impeding their independence of action. These are things that are getting in the way of their fulfilling whatever mental picture they see themselves as. So, pardon me. So Boyd goes on in great detail, and I'm just going to simply talk in terms of the less scientific aspects of what he's talking about. So what he's saying is basically we have this idea of independence of action, this idea of independence of action, of where we believe we should be, of where we believe we would be better off, and we work and behave in terms of fulfilling that objective. He uses different scientific facts, such as the second law of thermodynamics and the uncertainty principle. But I don't want to go into that right now. He concludes, as indicated earlier, these mental concepts are employed as decision models for individuals and societies for determining and monitoring actions needed to cope with their environment or to improve their capacity for independent action. Okay, so again, when we have a situation where the question of voting comes in, when a person will make the decision, right? Am I going to vote? Right? Am I 18 years or older? Right? Yes. Okay, do I want to vote? Yes or no, right? To vote. Yes or no? If it's yes, then which candidate do I want? Do I want candidate A or do I want candidate B? Or do I want candidate, a different candidate, right? And then the question would be, why? Right? Why do you want? So this whole decision tree and the whole idea is going on inside the person's head in the pseudo environment, and their real criteria is not just economics. Their real criteria is not just money. Who's going to give them something? The real criteria is their understanding of the independence of action. If I would tell you right now that a certain candidate is proposing a military draft, that would change that candidate's attractiveness to people who thought they might be drafted, right? If I was going to tell you that a certain candidate is going to do something that would wreck the value of your parents' home or of your home, that would give you a different mental picture of which candidate would do what. If I tell you, right, that a certain characteristic of a candidate is going to change your vote, maybe not, right? So our campaigns are now designed not only to get someone elected, but they're also designed to get people to say, no, I'm not going to vote. Why? Because if I'm a campaign manager, my job is to get a majority, not of the vote, especially for president, right? A majority of the electoral college. Or if I'm running a congressional campaign, my campaign is designed to get a majority of the voters, of the people who actually vote, not of the people who live in the district. So if I can tell you, or if I can convince you, if you're going to be my opposition, not to vote, I also win. And that's a campaign that we're going to talk about next time. We're going to talk about the mass media. We're going to talk about how it is that now we have campaigns that are very, very influential on this idea of painting a mental picture, of creating these fictions. Again, they're not lies, they are things that are not true or could be true, we don't know, but we perceive them as true. We perceive them as, and our behaviors might be stimulated by that mental picture. So again, I hope you see how we have a criteria on an individual level of independence of action. Does that person decide to cooperate or to compete or defect from the society? And we have a collective of the pseudo environment, of the understanding of the environment of our own picture of reality, not necessarily reality, but our behaviors. But when we behave, they are manifested in the environment. So again, I might be thinking, oh, this person loves me, and to save them from a moving bus, I'm going to kick them out of the way. That person might be thinking to themselves, hey, why did that person just kick me out of the way? Because they didn't see the bus. Or it could be, I hate that person, and I'm kicking them maybe into the bus, and I miss. The point is, the behavior, the person receiving the kick, all they know is not my motivations. All they know is, hey, you kicked me. And that's the difference between, again, the pseudo environment, our perception of reality, and our behaviors that are manifested in the real environment. As I said, next time we're talking about mass media and the elections, but I wanted to talk in terms of how the individual, how each of us perceive reality, and what is the criteria in our decision making. And that, of course, is this action, is this behavior going to create more independence of action or less? Until next time, we'll see you.